think part of the reason they've resonated so much for thousands of years is because they are so deeply human, deeply flawed. They're people like us. Yeah.
Echevarria. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I'm very pleased and privileged today to be speaking with Rene Echevarria, the executive producer of The Faithful Women in the Bible, which is begins this week on Fox, which is just incredible. Thank you so much, Rene. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. Good morning.
Good morning. It is wonderful to chat about this. I mean, this is uh, a fairly epic scale. It's something we haven't seen a lot, especially on network TV in recent years. As you tell the story of these seminal biblical women through the story of Genesis over 3 nights. Am I right? 2 hours over 3 nights.
Correct.
Uh,
Yes.
so how does something like this come to be? Like this is sort of a grand narrative.
Well, my partner on this project is Carol Mendelsohn, and she's a powerhouse producer in Hollywood. Responsible for the CSI franchise more than probably anybody. She ran it for years, was the head writer and executive producer, and it was she who came to me and said, I want to do a project about the women of the Bible. She knew I was a believer and that I love the Bible, and that's why she reached out to me. And I jumped at the chance to work with her. And part of the reason that you talk about the scale of the project is she tapped her Rolodex and brought on board as our first director a colleague of hers who directed dozens of CSIs, which was a very well put together show. And and yeah, that's kind of unusual, in this kind of biblical storytelling to have that kind of production value. But more
Yeah.
important, to us is our uh, you know the themes and the story that we're telling and the biblical fidelity of it all. So yeah, we're super excited. Premiere on March 22nd with the story of Sarah, and then on Palm Sunday with the story of Rebekah, and on Easter Sunday with the story of Sarah and Leah. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Rachel and Leah.
Rachel and Leah.
Rachel and
Um, it is interesting because again, like you have the countless women in Scripture
Leah.
who you could have focused on, but you decided to land and primarily focus the lens in Genesis and
Yes.
on these three stories. I was wondering what was the thinking behind choosing their journeys as your focus?
Well, we considered all sorts of things. We considered starting at the very beginning with Eve's story, and we talked about, maybe doing Eve's story and then Mrs. Noah, an unnamed woman of Scripture. But I think what attracted us to Genesis, the call of Abraham and Sarah's, participation and all that, and the family they built together was that it's the beginning of God calling his people to him, and it's the themes and the stories of these characters are so universal and still resonate today. Sarah's story is of infertility, is something people struggle with even now, and the options that were available to her were a little more complicated than, there wasn't the science that can be brought to bear, in the modern era. She turned to surrogacy in a sense. Um, but that meant putting her husband in the arms of another woman. And that fascinated us. That's what we really dug into. That's the emotional core of that story.
Yeah, it is interesting to see the connections, these conversations between the ancient story, if you will, and modern story and uh, um,
Yeah.
modern situations, as you say, with infertility, for example, is just being one issue. And perspective matters a great deal in this series. I think it's very important to it. And I know you said you're working with Carol, and can you talk about though the idea of telling the story through the eyes of these women as opposed to just as a more of a third person thing? You're really putting it in their minds as much as you can.
Yeah, one creative choice that we made early on that I think speaks to that. Um, I remember, in my first draft of the Sarah story, Sarah and Abraham and Hagar script, and I'd written, a version of the Call of Abraham. And I could see it in my mind, him talking to God and all this stuff, as Scripture describes it. And I remember sharing it with Carol, and she was like, "I mean, look, this is great. Trust me, there's nothing wrong with it, but." What would be Sarah's point of view of this? And we started to kick that around, and it was like we realized, no, for Sarah, it's waking up in the middle of the night and your husband's not in bed next to you, and wondering where he is, and walking out into the field and finding him there, and he's in this state you've never seen him in before. Um, so to really put the audience in her head, not his, we made the decision not to show it from his point of view, so that to emphasize for her, it was a trust in him, not a trust in God, that she agreed to leave her home and her kin and everything she'd ever known and embark into the unknown, on the basis of a promise. So that is just one example of how this lens of the women of the Bible just changes how you approach scripture. And it's been eye-opening for me. And that's just one example of how, it's made me look at these stories in a fresh way. And I hope, other people who know them, maybe it'll do as well. And hopefully for people who don't maybe aren't familiar with these stories, that it'll make them curious about them, and draw them in, uh, God can do a work in their heart. So.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that is so essential to the success of this story. If you're going to have a story called "The Faithful Women of the Bible," I think it's very important to find their voice, and that's what's happening here in these episodes. Now, having said that, I was wondering from your perspective, as you said, this really helped you and shaped you. What do you think surprised you most about these characters by looking at it from this new perspective, or maybe something that you think maybe we've misunderstood about them all this time?
Well, one thing that emerged, all three stories that we focused on, it, were very much stories about marriage, about marriages, three very different marriages. Sarah, like I just said, has to step out in trust and faith in her husband because God didn't speak to her, in pursuit of this thing that she wanted all her life. Was to start a family. Isaac and Rebekah. On Rebekah, it is put on her that it's God's you know plan that Jacob be the heir over his older brother Esau, which would have been very unconventional at the time. So she's put against the will of her husband. Um, and there are times in any marriage where you come against. There's an in, just most of the time we talk things through and we decide what we're going to do as a family. Sometimes you just fundamentally disagree, and they fundamentally disagreed, and it put her in a position of what was she willing to do. So it was a story of a marriage, and our third story, Rebecca's story. I'm sorry, Rachel and Leah's story. Well, obviously a different kind of marriage. It's they sisters who end up married to
Yeah,
the same man. So
little
yeah,
different with Leah and Rachel.
so that was a commonality that emerged, but within each one, there were things that surprised me. I think on my first read, and I think many people, you read Genesis and you go, "Yeah, it's possible to read it and think Sarah kind of comes off like the bad guy." Some of her choices are what we nowadays call problematic, right? You know, um, putting her husband in the arms of another woman, under what circumstances, how much choice did Hagar have about this?
Yeah.
Um, uh, that already is complicated. And then, of course, 13 years later, when she has a child of her own, banishing them, saying, asking her husband to send them away. You go, oh my gosh, but the more I dug into it, I guess in the process, I realized that yes, both of those actions are hard to get your head around, but at the same time, God, on some level, validated both those things, because when Hagar runs away pregnant, God doesn't say to her in the desert, "You go, girl, you go get your freedom." You know, he says, "Go back. Go back to your go back and give this child to Sarah." Um, and when Sarah asks Abraham to banish them years later, Scripture tells us Abraham is very upset. He doesn't like this at all. But God later tells him, listen to the voice of your wife. So on some level, God was validating not the choices Sarah made, but I like to think, yeah, I think Sarah stumbled in her faith when she decided to take matters into her own hands and you know recruit Hagar, and the result was Ishmael. But as Romans tells us, God makes a good work of all those he calls to his purpose, right? So God made something of that. He blessed Ishmael. He wanted to make sure that Ishmael was raised by his father in those first 13 years. So he said, go back, and on some level, I mean, the story I tried to tell is that Sarah was doing something that really was hard for her emotionally, to send this boy that she loved away, but she did it for what she perceived to be the best for the two of them, because she had complicated God's plan. So that's a long answer, but yeah, that's the process, for me, and it's just been a amazing, fascinating deep dive, you know.
Well, certainly. And I mean, the scripture is for men and women marred with stories of people who God has to sort of redirect, shall we,
Yeah,
to put it mildly, broken people. And there's a lot more honesty there in terms of the human experience, I think, than people realize. And I think we see that.
yeah, yeah. That's a great point. And we have our sort of our Sunday school summation, of these characters. But when you really read them, I think part of the reason they've resonated so much for thousands of years is because they are so deeply human, deeply flawed. They're people like us. You know, Carol had a great phrase she used to say. She said, it was the last thing she said to me before I went off to write the first script. Rene, write them like they don't know they're in the Bible. They don't know they're Bible characters. And it was a great insight, you know.
I
Um,
love that. I
yeah,
love that. I've never heard that before but that is an absolutely honest phrasing. Like the
yeah,
reality is whenever we tell the stories, we tell it with sort of this, no pun intended, pastoral quality, you know,
yeah,
and clear lines. But these are people who are, just trying to figure things out in
yeah,
their circumstance. I
yeah.
think
And
that's
Scripture's
a
not
beautiful
afraid.
line.
For Scripture is not afraid to show them warts and all. Which some scholars say is an argument for their historical validity. That if you were
Yeah.
just engaged in the process of myth making, you would mythologize and make them above reproach. But that's not what Scripture tells us.
Mm.
So but making emotional sense of things these people did for Rachel, and Leah sleeping with her husband, with her sister's husband on their wedding night.
Yeah.
Make emotional sense of that, without making her the villain, or yeah. It was really, really, uh, the best challenge of my career.
I love that. And I mean, certainly you've had lots of experience. I mean, Star Trek, your role, with all the writing on Star Trek, that's a series that's really about perspective. And
Mhm.
so to be on a series like this, taking you into that lens as well from in a different context, I think is an incredible experience, to be honest. It
Yeah.
sounds like
Yeah.
really formative. Uh, honestly, Renee, I really appreciate the chance to chat with you. Thank you so much. The series does air on Fox three successive weeks, beginning on the 22nd. Is that right? At 8 p.m. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, three, and then Palm Sunday, and then on Easter Sunday, and to be clear, that's Fox, your local Fox station, where you watch your football.
That's right. There it is. There it is.
Football and Bible. Thank you, Fox.
Renee, thank you so much for the chance to chat. I really appreciate it. Have
It
a
was great
wonderful
to
day.
talk to you too. All
Great to
right.
talk to you too.
All right.